Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. You know, if you ask a kid in South Africa, when is New Year? Well, they say 16th of January, that's school New Year. 1st of January is another New Year. 1st of March, their father's always speaking about fiscal New Year. The truth of the matter, if you look in the Jewish calendar, there are a whole bunch of New Years as well. Rosh Hashana is the anniversary of the creation of man. The 15th of Shvat is Tu B'Shvat, the New Year of the anniversary of the trees. The 19th of Kislev is the most special day in the entire calendar. It's called Rosh Hashana of Chassidus. It's the new year for the revelation of the highest level of godliness in the world, which we call Yechidus, which we call the Yechidish Torah. There is nobody better to tell us about the history, about the journey, about the experience than Rabbi Dubov to explain this very important date and very important weekend. I just want to point out that today was the Rebbe's wedding anniversary, and the Rebbe always said about today that this made him a Rebbe. Not that we accept that, but that this made him a Rebbe. Today, the 14th of Kislev. So it's just such a powerful month. If you look at the month of Kislev, there's Rosh Chodesh Kislev, there's the 9th of Kislev, the 10th of Kislev, the 14th of Kislev, the 19th and 20th of Kislev, there's Hanukkah. Kislev is just all about bringing light into darkness. But there's nobody better to take us on this journey than our dear special colleague who does this week after week for us, Rabbi Dubov, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Masinta. As you quite rightly said, we are now in the days of preparation before the holy special day of Yud Tes Kislev, the 19th of Kislev. And this evening, what I would like to do is to give an overview, not so much of the history of Yud Tes Kislev, because that can be found in the books on it, Chabad.org. There's a tremendous amount of the history of Yud Tes Kislev which is written, but I'd like to focus more on the spiritual significance and holiness of the day, especially in the prism and in the light of how the Rabbeim of Chabad called Yud Tes Kislev, what appellations and names they called it. So very briefly to recount the history, the Hasidic movement was found by the Baal Shem Tov. When he passed away, the leadership was taken over by Rabbi Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich. And when he passed away, in fact, on the 19th of Kislev, the leadership was taken over by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. In fact, the Maggid had a number of disciples, and each disciple in their area took forward the teachings of Chassidus. And in general, it was split into two groups. One, what we call Chagas Chassidus, and Rabbi Shneur Zalman blazed a new path in the teachings of Chassidus, an intellectual approach called Chabad. And much of that history is written already. I'm not going to review it over here. In 1798, the Alter Rebbe was arrested. The revealed reason for his arrest was because there were a number of Jews in the community, in the establishment, who didn't approve of the Alter Rebbe's new ways. Also, there were some people who wanted to implicate him in the support for Turkey, which was then an arch enemy of Russia. And consequently, he was arrested on Trump charges and incarcerated for 53 days in a prison in St. Petersburg. And on the day of Yud Tes Kislev, the 19th of Kislev, he was set free, and it became a Chag HaGeula, a festival of liberation and redemption for all generations. The Alter Rebbe himself said that the real reason he was incarcerated was because of a kitrug, a heavenly accusation. The teachings of Kabbalah had been taught clandestinely in small circles throughout history. In the 16th century, in the days of the Arizal, he already said it was a mitzvah legalos zois hachachma, a mitzvah to reveal this wisdom. However, it still was in small pockets and amongst the elite. It was in the days of the Baal Shem Tov that the Baal Shem Tov started teaching the inner dimension of the Torah to wider circles, but never had it been packaged in such a way that the average intellect would be able to appreciate it and integrate it. And this was the new path blazed by the Alter Rebbe, and that aroused a heavenly accusation. In fact, the Alter Rebbe said that although the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid had already passed on to the next world, they actually came to visit the Alter Rebbe when he was in prison, and he asked them as to why this imprisonment had taken place, and they told him it was because of this heavenly accusation, and he asked them, should he stop? And they said that no, that now that he'd begun, he should continue. And in fact, when Mashiach himself answered the Baal Shem Tov one Rosh Hashana and told him, when Mashiach will come, when Yofutzu ma'neisecha chutza, a quote from a verse in the book of Proverbs and Mishlei, when your teachings will be widely disseminated, the Alter Rebbe said that the principal hafotza, dissemination of the teachings of Chassidus started after Peterburg, started after his release, because then he felt what had been given from heaven was a green light, a vindication of his path, that he was now to start disseminating his teachings broadly, widely, in a way of Chochmah, Bina, and Das, understanding and integrating the knowledge of Jewish mysticism so that it was bound and one with the revealed part of the Torah, and most important, with the revealed operation of the Jew. And of course, this took on the form of 7 generations of Chabad leaders, the Alter Rebbe, the Mitzler Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Rashab, the Friedrich Rebbe, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who took the teachings of Chassidus to a completely new level, as we know. That's the history of Yud Tes Kislev, and now I'd like to launch into its spiritual dimension, its holiness, and how the Rabbeim spoke and talked about Yud Tes Kislev. And of course, when we understand and look at Yud Tes Kislev, how they understood it, then it will be so much more meaningful to us. The first point is that the previous Rebbe called Yud Tes Kislev Chag HaChagim. It's the festival of all festivals. That itself requires understanding that appellation. What does it mean, the festival of all festivals? After all, each festival has a special meaning. Each festival has its own mitzvahs connected to it. In what way can we say that Yud Tes Kislev is the festival of all festivals? So by having a look at the festivals themselves and how the Rabbeim called Yud Tes Kislev, we'll actually come full circle at the end of this presentation to understand why the previous Rebbe called it the festival of all festivals. But let's start with one name which the Rabbeim called Yud Tes Kislev. They called it the Matantorum of Pnimius HaTorah. It was the day, it is the day that the inner aspect of the Torah was given to us. What does that mean? In the Jewish world, we know that we celebrate Shavuos as the day of Matantorum. It was in the month of Sivan, Vav Sivan, that Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai, Hashem came down on Mount Sinai and gave the Jewish people the Torah. And that experience was a one-off. It will not be repeated. What was given was the entire Torah. Torah Shebesav, Torah Shebal Peh. And Moshe Rabbeinu, when he went up on the mountain, he took the entire Torah, he was given the entire Torah, and he rolled it out during 40 years in the wilderness, eventually finishing a Sefer Torah and placing it in the Aron HaKodesh. What he heard on Sinai, was explained, the explanation of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, as we know, and Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the Torah Shebechsav and gave over the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Included in the Torah Sheba'al Peh was the mystical tradition. But as we know, until the times of the Rashbi, the mystical tradition was not written down. Some say that the Sefer Yetzirah was in fact authored by Avraham Avinu, but in terms of a published book, the greatest published book of mystical teachings was in fact the Zohar, written by Reb Shimon bar Yochai, in fact only later published and written in the 13th century by Reb Moshe de Leon. So as history moved on, you had very little written, if you want, dimension of the Pnimis HaTorah. At Sinai, however, let's just go back to Sinai a moment, when the moment the Torah was given, a major barrier was broken down. The Midrash says it in the following way. Before Sinai, prior to Mount Sinai, all the mitzvahs which the patriarchs kept were in a spiritual form, because there was a decree that the people of Rome could not go down to Syria, and the people of Syria could not go up to Rome. There was a divide between the spiritual realm and the earthly realm. And consequently, although the Talmud tells us that the patriarchs kept the entire Torah before it was given, that was only in a spiritual way. So, for example, the whole story of the wells or the sticks of Yaakov, in the Zohar, it says that the sticks of Yaakov is what we do when we're putting on tefillin. Yaakov was doing the same thing with the sticks. But what that means is he didn't actually put tefillin on, but he effected what we effect when we put on tefillin in a spiritual way by doing what he did. But the spiritual influence was not captured in the physical world. When Sinai took place, that barrier was broken down, and the upper worlds were allowed to descend to the lower worlds, and the lower worlds were allowed to ascend to the higher worlds. And at Sinai, an amazing fusion took place in the sense that now heaven and earth could fuse together. So Torah essentially cascaded down as God's pristine wisdom, like water which falls in a waterfall and comes down to earth in a material form, in which we can perform mitzvahs, we can learn Torah as it's presented in this world, and yet what we're doing is connecting with pristine divine wisdom down here in this world. In that sense, Yud Tes Kislev is the Matantorum of Pnimis HaTorah. Just like 3 months after the Exodus, in the month of Nisan Iyar Sivan was the giving of the Torah, so too after the month of Tishrei, Cheshvan Kislev, in the 3rd month, the Torah was given in its inner dimension, revealed in the sense, like we spoke beforehand, in a way of Chabad, that the novelty of Chabad is that the barrier between mysticism as it was, something detached from the intellect, something, if you want, mystical, became integrated within the intellect and became presented in such a way that a person, an average intellect person, would be able to use that intellect, that what we call haskalah, and integrate it into avodah, their own service of Hashem, in order that they should know Hashem, love Hashem, fear Hashem properly as understood in Chassidus Chabad. So in that respect, Yud Tes Kislev is the Matantorum of Pnimis HaTorah. Now we find a very fascinating thing. Just like in the development of Torah Shebaal Peh, first Mishnah was revealed in terms of writing. It took a long time, for many, many centuries. The Torah Shebaal Peh was not written down. It was only in the days of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi that Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law, was written down, and even then with great brevity in the Mishnah. And then it was explained in the Gemara, and then we had the periods of the Rishonim and the Acharonim who gave further elucidation. Similarly, in the revelation of the Pnimius HaTorah, of the inner dimension of the Torah, it was not all revealed at once. It was a process. And the same thing is true in the 7 generations of Chabad teachings. The Alter Rebbe, he is compared to the Sephira of Chochmah, in the sense that Chochmah represents the quintessential point. The Alter Rebbe laid out the principles in Tanya and in many Mamorim, which were later collected on Torah, Bereshit Shemos in a book called Torah Or, and in Vayikra B'Amidah B'Dvarim in Lekutei Torah. In those Mamorim discourses, you have laid out in principle form all the principles of Chassidus. His son, Rabbi Dov Ber, the Mittler Rebbe, took the Nukuda, took the points, and like the Sephira of Bina, expanded on them in breadth and depth, and like a wide gushing river, took the dot and expanded it right throughout the palace. The next Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe of Chabad, his novelty was that he sourced every teaching of Chassidus in all 4 sections of the Torah, of Pardes, Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Soid. So if you have a look at the Chassidus of the Tzemach Tzedek, he'll bring a concept of Chassidus and anchor it in Pshat, in Nigla, in the Gemara, in the Medrash, in the Zohar, in the commentaries, in the Ramban, in the Kli Yakar, in later writings, the writings of the Maharal, and so on and so forth. And so you see the inner and the outer, the Nigla and the Nista of the Torah, as one complete integrated system. His son, the Rebbe Maharash, Rabbi Shmuel Lubavitch, he started something called Hemsheichim, developed themes in Chassidus, which he would take a concept and every Shabbos he would develop that theme. That took on greater vitality by his son, the Rebbe Rashab, who was called the Rambam of Chassidus, in the sense that he took the principles of Chassidus and developed them with long hemsheichim, long themes, sometimes spanning years. His famous Maimah of B'shar Shehekdimu, Tov Reish Ayin Beis, spanned 4 years, some of which was said, some of which was written, but there you'll find the deepest concepts in Chassidus and in Kabbalah. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe took these ideas even further outwards, in the sense that he translated many of the concepts of Chassidus into different languages. And of course, with our Rebbe, it took on a completely new level. First of all, primarily in the printing of Hasidic works, which today you have libraries full of Mamorim. All the treasured Kisvei Yad, handwritten books, were now in printed form. And of course, with the advent of the internet, today the world is awash with the teachings of Chassidus, and today you can zoom the whole wide world. Simultaneously, access to the most deepest and beautiful teachings of the Torah. So in terms of Matantorum, the day of Yud Tes Kislev is called the day of the giving of the Torah, and it's an ongoing process. Every single year, a new light shining forth. And in that sense, therefore, Yud Tes Kislev is called the Rosh Hashana of Hasidic teachings. Rosh Hashana is the head of the year, not the beginning, but the head. The Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya that every single Rosh Hashanah, a new lease of energy comes to the world. Just like we have the concept of freehold and leasehold in property, the divine creative packets of energy that come to the world come in limited packets in terms of a year at a time. That packet of energy is released in its general form on Rosh Hashanah, and hence it's called the Rosh of the year. The same is true in the teachings of Chassidus. The new level of understanding and depth is presented on Rosh Hashanah. And a person needs to be receptive to that new revelation, because new powers are granted from above that each individual can open their mind and heart to perceiving and understanding this Torah. One just needs to tune into its frequency in order to be able to receive it. There is a very, very beautiful letter which the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Rebbe of Chabad, wrote about Yud Tes Kislev. In fact, it's printed in the book Hayom Yom, which is the diary which the Rebbe wrote in 1942, in which he put an aphorism for every single day of the year. The book actually starts with the day of Yud Tes Kislev and goes around the whole year until it reaches the day of the 18th of Kislev. So we see in the book itself the central importance of the day of Yud Tes Kislev. And before the Rebbe writes the entry for Yud Tes Kislev itself, he gives an introduction, a excerpt of a letter of the Rebbe Rashab, which is well worth reading out. He writes the following: Yud Tes Kislev, Hachag asher poda b'shalom nafshenu. This is the festival which God redeemed in peace our souls. V'oir v'chayas nafshenu niten lanu. The light and the life of our souls has been given to us on this day. Now, light is a reference to haskalah, intellectual appreciation and understanding. Chayas, life, is a reference to our avodah, to our service of God, which should be full of lebedikite. It should be alive. It shouldn't be sterile. It shouldn't be dead. It shouldn't be rote. It shouldn't be robotic. Rather, it should be alive. This is given to us by an infusion of Torah Chassidus, which is given to us on this day. Hayoim hazehu Rosh Hashana ledivrei Elokim chayim. This day is the Rosh Hashana for the words of the living God, asher hinchilanu aviseinu hakadoshim, which our Rebbes have given us as an inheritance. Vehihi Torah Baal Shem Tov. And this is the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. Listen to what the Rebbe Rashab writes next. This day, the day of Yud Tes Kislev, is the beginning of your deeds. It's the complete perfection and complete intent, true intent of the creation of man on earth. To draw down a revelation of the inner dimension of our Torah, which is drawn down on this day of Yud Tes Kislev as a general infusion for the entire year. And it's up to us to arouse our hearts on this day in an inner and essential desire from the quintessential point of truth in our hearts, that we should illuminate our own souls with that beautiful light of the inner dimension of the Torah. That is Yud Tes Kislev. Just to think about it, the awesomeness of this day, that this is the day when the new release of light and life, Pnimius, comes for the entire year. Wow, we really need to get ready for it. In fact, the Rebbe Marash says that one needs to prepare 3 months for Yud Tes Kislev. If you work it out, 3 months before Yud Tes Kislev comes to the day of Chai Elul, the 18th of Elul, the birthday of the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe. And in fact, those 3 months, each month stands for 1 month stands for Chochmah, a second month for Bina, and a third month for Das, because one needs to prepare in Chochmah, Bina, and Das from the birthday of the Alter Rebbe and the Baal Shem Tov for the holy day of Yud Tes Kislev. So it's an awesome day. In fact, the Alter Rebbe himself said, Hikdashti, I've sanctified the day of Yud Tes Kislev like Yom Kippur. And any request that a Jew makes on this day will be accepted. It's got such an awesomeness. What is the connection of Yom Kippur and the giving of the Torah, like we said beforehand? Because we know on Yom Kippur, that's when the Jewish people received the second set of luchos. That's the day they received the second set of tablets, and they were on the level of Baalei Teshuvah. And as we know, a Baal Teshuvah stands on a higher level than a tzaddik. The rejoicing of that receiving of the second tablets is on Simchas Torah. And in fact, there's a beautiful story about the celebration of Yud Tes Kislev by the Tzemach Tzedek. It says that he actually danced hakofes on Yud Tes Kislev with a Tanya, just like we dance hakofes on Simchas Torah with a Sefer Torah. In other words, he so much felt that on this day the inner Torah was given, like on the day of the giving of the Torah, like on Simchas Torah, that he took the Tanya and he danced with it. There's a beautiful idea over here. On Simchas Torah, we don't take a Sefer Torah, open it, and read it and learn it. Yes, of course, we have the Koriyas HaTorah by finishing B'Zos HaBracha and starting Bereshis, but it's not a day primarily of learning, it's primarily a day of rejoicing. And the reason is because what we're rejoicing over is not just the Torah, but the Noisei Torah, the giver of the Torah. And in that respect, the Tzemach Tzedek, when he was dancing with the Tanya, what he was joyful for on the day of Yud Tes Kislev was the fact that he felt that Yud Tes Kislev, being the Matantorum of Pnimius Torah, this is the day that we feel the giver of the Torah, the inner dimension of the giver of the Torah, in the inner dimension of our souls, as revealed to us in the inner dimension of the Torah. The celebration of Yud Tes Kislev was so great that even in the days of the Alter Rebbe, they asked the Alter Rebbe, the Chassidim asked the Alter Rebbe, whether they could actually write the story of Yud Tes Kislev in a Megillah, like we have the story of Purim. Just like we have the story of Purim, we read a Megillah and we have a Yom Tov. So the Chassidim thought, let's write a Megillas Yud Tes Kislev, and every Yud Tes Kislev will read the Megillah and will rejoice, etc. And the Alter Rebbe said no. Why? Because it's not necessary to write a Megillah. And he said such beautiful words. He said, on this day of Yud Tes Kislev, it will be fixed as a Yom Tov T'midi, an eternal festival in the Jewish people. And on this day, Yiskadel v'Yiskadash Shmei Rabbah, the great name of God will be magnified and sanctified, and thousands of Jews will be aroused to do teshuvah on this day. And they will serve Hashem with their entire heart, because this story is in fact engraved in the heart of Yisrael above and written in the heart of Yisrael below. What did the Alter Rebbe mean? First of all, a Yom Tov Tamidi, an eternal festival, doesn't just mean that every year we will celebrate the festival. A Yom Tov Tamidi means that this Yom Tov has an effect on every single day of the year. That's what it means. It's not just a Yom Tov celebrated once a year. It's a Yom Tov which is celebrated because its impact is felt every single day of the year. And when the Alter Rebbe said it's engraved in the heart, we know that the difference between writing and engraving is that writing is ink on parchment, where the ink and parchment are two separate entities. When something is engraved in something, it's part and parcel of it. Yud Tes Kislev, Pnimius HaTorah, is not something which is another idea, which is put together with what we have already, but it's the revelation of our very essence. And consequently, he said, it's not necessary to write a Megillah of Yud Tes Kislev, because Jews will celebrate it because it is the revelation of the very essence of the soul. And now we come full circle to understanding why the previous Rebbe called it the Chag HaChagim. If we have a look in the Gemara, it tells us about Chagim, about festivals, that they are Lashem and Lachem. They are for God and for us. Literally on a Yom Tov, we spend half the day serving Hashem and half the day we eat and drink. There's a part of it for the body and there's a part of it for the soul. That's why the previous Rebbe called it the Chag HaChagim, because Yud Tes Kislev is not a day of celebration of mystics, something detached from this world. Quite on the contrary, the giving of Pnimius HaTorah of Chassidus was so that it would address both the soul and the body, so that there would be a fusion between heaven and earth, like we said, which happened on Matantorum, the giving of the Torah, when Hashem came down and Moshe went up and the decree was abolished. It's about a complete oneness in body and soul, a oneness in heaven and earth, a oneness in spiritual and material, and a complete and wholesome service of Hashem, so that our soul permeates our body, and the body is a vehicle to the soul, a vehicle of expression of Hashem's will. Ultimately, Yud Tes Kislev is not just a celebration for Chabad Hasidim. Yud Tes Kislev is a celebration for every single Jew. The Rambam writes, what will the Jewish people be doing when Mashiach comes? In that time, there'll be tremendous bounty. In fact, delicacies will be found all over the place, like gold. There will be tremendous plenty. So what will the engagement of the Jewish people be? So the Rambam says, Lo da'as es Hashem bilvad, kefi kayach ha'odam, to know God according to the capacity of man. If you think about those words, that's exactly what Torah's Chassidus is. It's the knowledge of God using the parameters of the human mind, which the Almighty endowed us with, using our Chochmah, Bina, and Das to know Hashem, to fear Hashem, to love Hashem, those two being the movers and shakers of the fulfillment of all the other mitzvahs, because all the positive mitzvahs stem and are motivated and inspired by the love of God, and all the don'ts, the negative mitzvahs, are made sure to be kept when a person is in a state of cognizance and awe of Hashem. And those two are fueled by the Chabad, by the full appreciation and intellectual comprehension of the greatness of Hashem and of our central importance in the fulfillment of the purpose of creation, which is that Hashem desired that we create an abode for Hashem down here in this world. To finish, the Baal Shem Tov said to Mashiach that he will come when Yofutzu Ma'anesecha Chutza. It is incumbent on each one of us to disseminate the teachings of Chassidus, and that will bring Mashiach. First of all, in our own chutzah, in our own outer levels, in those areas of engagement in which perhaps are void or are missing inspiration, connection, divine. That's where we need to bring the mayon, the wellspring of these beautiful teachings, and then literally outwards to the lowest of places, which is why Yud Tes Kislev is always connected with the Sedra and the Parsha, usually of Vayishlach, in the sense that Yaakov comes to Esav, and he, in fact, his job ultimately is to elevate Esav, is to refine Esav, so that Esav too eventually comes back to his spiritual source, which are, as explained in the teachings of Chassidus and Kabbalah, the oros of Tohu, the lights of Tohu. But as Yaakov refines them, they're brought within the kelim of Tikkun, the vessels of the world of Tikkun. And consequently, let us all prepare for this awesome day of Yud Tes Kislev, the day which is the giving of the Torah, of the inner dimension of the Torah, the day, as we have explained, which is the Rosh Hashana of Chassidic teachings, the day which the Alter Rebbe says is like Yom Kippur. He sanctified it so that all requests will be accepted on this day, the day of Simchas Torah, in which the Tzemach Tzedek danced with the Tanya, because the inner dimension of the Torah was celebrated, revealing the inner dimension of the soul, which reveals to us the very essence of godliness, and therefore it's written in our hearts like a Megillah, but not ink on parchment, but engraved. And the day sheyiskadol v'yiskadash shmei Rabbah, the name of Hashem will be sanctified and magnified, and thousands will be aroused to do teshuvah. Let us prepare properly for this day, and most importantly, let us take on good decisions in our own learning of Chassidus and in the learning of Chassidus with others. And hopefully, very, very soon, if we'll fulfill this Yafutzu Ma'anesecha Chutza, then we'll merit the Ka'asi Mar, the coming of Mashiach, B'mheira v'yameinu mamash.